Welcome back to our special, The Foundation of America. No one better to talk to on this than Richard C. Lyons, author of 3 relevant books. Volume 1 is called The DNA of Democracy. I cannot recommend it enough. The DNA of Democracy. Buy it immediately. Number 2, Shadows of the Acropolis, and his newest, Passage Through the Shadows. Richard C. Lyons, how are you, sir?
Very good, Mike. Great to see you again.
Grateful you're here. Let's start off with this question. What do you think our founders would think about us now today?
I would think they'd be looking at the present state of society and be very alarmed by the encroachments into our rights. And part of those rights are the individual right to faith. I think they would be utterly alarmed that they worked as hard as they did to craft a constitution that separated power and diffused it throughout society. And the first thing that would alarm them would be a society wherein different religious sects were under attack, like the Catholicism in America is under attack today. They would be very alarmed by that. They would be alarmed by the anti-Semitism in America today. And I can tell you why. If we can step back in history, I can show the lineage of how our Pilgrims created our Constitution based on the first common law humanity ever received. And that would be in the frame of the 10 Commandments. So in the time of Moses, you had the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh was an absolute power. And the Pharaoh demanded that he be venerated as a god and that his will would never be challenged by anybody. Well, the Israelites believed that their God was God and Pharaoh was not. And because of that, they were enslaved for centuries. To preserve their spiritual freedom, they suffered physical slavery for centuries, culminating in Moses was born a prince of Egypt. Moses might have been Pharaoh, but instead of becoming Pharaoh and ruling absolutely and tyrannically, he saw his nature, his true nature, as an Israelite, a Jew, and so became a lawgiver, freed his people from the shackles of tyranny, and went to Sinai, where he received the first common law of humanity, divinely, this is very key, divinely derived and of a higher meaning than Pharaoh's laws. He went to Sinai and was given the 10 Commandments as a matter of fire written into stone, which means divine inspiration written into the world, right? And that founded later in history our common rights, our Bill of Rights, our freedom of faith. But it took different passages because tyranny is always the same and freedom is always the same. So when we go to Rome during the Republic era, the realm of faith was under one power. And the realm of councils and senate were another power. They were civic. The other was spiritual. When the Republic fell and came under the emperors of Rome, it's exemplary that the Roman emperors took upon themselves, right, the spiritual authority in order to exercise an absolute tyranny without any other power being between them and the people's beliefs. If the emperor could control the people's beliefs, yes, then he held absolute power. We see this happen again in medieval Europe. Medieval Europe was very benefited by the fact that the ecclesiastical power of Rome was separate from the civil powers of the kings and the aristocracies. Why? Because the spiritual authority, its law, was always held above the civil law, right? And so there were two entities that competed, civil structure and spiritual structure. Now, where we find that changed was in the reign of Henry VIII. Everybody knows Henry VIII. What most people don't know is the means of his marrying Anne Boleyn and divorcing Catherine of Aragon was that he had to involve in himself both the kingship and the head of the church in England. To do so, he created a schism with the Church of Rome and put upon himself the civil and spiritual authority. And that became the divine right of kings, which fragmented the church in England among many different disparate sects, one of which were the Puritans. So when Charles I came into power, the first Stuart king, and demanded that everybody in England be Catholic, the Pilgrims sent their first wave of pilgrims off to the New World, first to Holland, then to the New World, to find a freedom of religion that they could not find in England. The Puritans that stayed behind in England actually formed 20 years later the armies of Cromwell. So they became the army of the House of Commons. They were largely formed of Puritans. And they won the war. They won the Civil War, right? But then lost the Restoration. In 1660, Charles II came back and was restored to power. When he was restored to power, the Puritans in England said, my gosh, we won the war and lost the peace. And they were persecuted in England. So another huge wave of pilgrims came over to America from there because they did not want to be dictated to by a king as to their faith. So you had these two huge waves of pilgrims, and you also had some Dutch that came over, suffering from the same anxieties that they wanted freedom of religion. Therefore, in America, there is a great distinction between civil authority and spiritual authority. And it continued into Constitution. But first, there was a great democratization, and I should explain what that is. In the place of a single pope or the place of a single Archbishop of Canterbury, where if you were going to visit the Archbishop of Canterbury, you entered into the Cathedral of Canterbury, a massive edifice in which there's all these statuaries, ornate and elegant decorations, an altar that is way on high and at the back of the cathedral. And if you look above, you see paintings of the Christ as being the King of Heaven. And he too is in regalia of a king, not distant, and holding a power in the clouds, not on earth. The new vision in America was that Christ was a carpenter. He was born in a barn. And where their churches was at the end of the street that they self-constructed. And the person who was the pastor was not a pope or his archbishop or an archbishop's priest. It was one of the persons from the town who knew the Bible the best and was elected to be the head of the congregation. So do you see the difference? That one is the top down and one is the bottom up authority. And the ultimate democratization of faith in America was during they call it the Great Awakening of 1730s and 40s, where it was the Holy Spirit that informed congregations. And the Holy Spirit meant that your faith was not in the church any longer. It was in your chest. It wasn't in the Pope's office. It wasn't in a Pope's palace or an archbishop's. It was in your chest.
I only got about 2 minutes, and I hate this. I hate only talking to you for 12 minutes. That's why I think last time we talked on the radio, we spent an hour. And one reason I love your books so much is it just opens up my world to all these things that have happened for thousands of years, that if they did not, today would be totally different. Every single story you talked about, back from 10 Commandments into Greece, Rome, all these things had to happen in such a way, England, so that some people, as we'll talk about in my last segment, hopped on a boat called the Mayflower over to America and then launched from there. And I just love connecting the dots. No book I've ever read connects the dots. Your books do, like you are now.
It's an organic lineage of freedom. And it's all these little things that happened in history, as you say, Mike, that came to a flowering in the age of our Constitution
that we're living now. So I guess my last question, the minute remaining, what would you say is one value of our founding that we have lost that you wish we could grab back again?
We need to stand in defense of the divine derivation of our rights. It goes back to the 10 Commandments, Mike. The 10 Commandments came from God, and they are God on earth. Our rights are God's gift to us. It's not the gift of a state. What the left has been trying to do for years is to limit our rights and to invade our Bill of Rights and our Constitution. And we have to stand in defense of our founding principles and the separation of powers between civil and spiritual.
Well, the attack makes sense, right? That they would do that because if they want to get rid of, if you get rid of God, which is what they've tried to say, well, then there could be no divine rights.
No,
that's
then
one of
they
the
are
benefits of getting rid of God.
And they are God. They become God.
That's right.
Like the Pharaoh.
That's right. They become Pharaoh.
Like Henry VIII.
They become Caesar.
That was
the
what
divine
Hitler,
right of king.
That's what Hitler was. He became a deity in Germany through the state.